everyone, and welcome to this panel at Interchange. I've just realised how on brand I am, that I've got the orange theme of environment, and I put the top on this morning. Absolute accident. So thank you for joining us this afternoon for this panel, and the panel is on thinking about co-benefits by design, and in particular, how transport projects create value for far beyond movement, such as reducing emissions, restoring nature, building climate resilience and improving community well-being. And I'm Colette Carroll, and I am the Managing Director of Transportation for Atkins Realis in the UK and Ireland. And transportation is clearly entangled in the climate and ecological emergencies. Transport is the UK's highest emitting sector, with surface transport alone producing 24% of the UK emissions in 2023, largely from cars. And we must cut those emissions by 86% to meet the 7th carbon budget. The network has historically fragmented habitats, contributing to 19% average decline of species in the UK since 1970, and a further 54% reduction in where flowering plants are found across the UK. And against that, transport must also operate in a rapidly changing climate, where once extreme weather is now routine. The UK has warmed by 0.25 degrees per decade since the 1980s, with 2022 to 2024 among the 5 warmest years recorded. Already, 38% of roads and 37% of our railways face flood risk, and with projections, that is forecast to rise to 46% and 54% by 2050. So what do these pressures mean? These pressures, they increase the cost and complexity of maintenance and renewals. They disconnect communities and deepen transport-related social exclusion. They drive biodiversity loss, undermining the ecosystem services that we depend upon, such as food production and clean water. And they also place additional strain on public services, especially health. But shared challenges need shared solutions. So I'm delighted today to be joined by a very fabulous panel who are going to join us in a conversation to explore actually how we think about these issues and also the kinds of solutions that we may need. And I'm going to ask, as I go and sit down with our lovely panel, I'm going to ask, starting with Naomi, for Naomi just to introduce herself, and as we come through the panel, everybody will introduce themselves, and then I will start off with some questions. But please just have a little think about how you want to join this conversation, because we will have time for Q&A at the end as well. So Naomi.
Thank you very much, Colette. I'm Naomi Green. I'm Managing Director of England's Economic Heartland, which is the subnational transport body that covers the Oxford to Cambridge Growth Corridor part of the UK.
Hi, I'm Melanie Corcoran. I'm the Exec Director for Transport at South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority.
Hi, I'm James Woodcock. I'm just now Professor of Public Health and Simulation at the University of Loughborough, and I was until like a week ago Professor of Transport and Health Modelling at the University of Cambridge.
I'm Patricia Thornley. I've also got dual roles, so I'm Professor of Sustainable Fuels at Aston University, but 4 weeks ago I became the Department for Transport's new Chief Scientific Advisor.
Fantastic. And so as you can see, we've got a great panel this afternoon with a wealth of experience, but also some really different perspectives. So we're going to start off with the panel all getting the same question, have a little think about. And we'll start with Naomi. And Naomi, for you, what does best-in-class transport look like when it delivers stacked benefits for people, place, climate and nature, rather than single outcomes?
Well, when you were actually talking, Colette, at the beginning, I was thinking, what's interesting is that from a geography like we have in the Oxford to Cambridge Growth Corridor, which has got a huge amount of interest in it from an economic perspective, but actually if you turn that round and start from environmental drivers, what you also find along the way is that you then add in many, many other benefits that really you would expect to see from a transport perspective, that perhaps if we only look at economic growth, we do risk maximising the opportunity of. So in the Oxcam region, where obviously we have a new railway coming, East West Rail, that covers 6 radial routes into London and really truly unlocks East West connectivity in a high-performing economic cluster, a lot of the work we're doing is around what's the role in that railway, not just for connecting economic growth, but more about creating an environmental corridor, a green corridor, a nature corridor, a tourism corridor, a skills corridor, an investment corridor, an innovation corridor. And each of those different corridors require different types of partnerships and different types of relationships and different outcomes. To do that requires an awful lot of work, but actually in the case of a scheme, a transformational scheme like East West Rail, but not just all of those major transformational schemes, actually, if you don't do those other things, you don't realise the benefits that you could actually achieve from them. So while it might not work from a conventional BCR perspective, they may not be things that you'd capture through a BCR, they are better outcomes. And hopefully, if we can learn from that as we go through into the future Green Book reviews will actually be able to capture some of those wider transformational benefits that we've put into place.
I think we might get onto Green Book a little bit further as we go through. I'm going to guess that. And Melanie, with your perspective from South Yorkshire.
Yeah, for me, we're building integrated transport systems, and it underpins economic growth, social, environmental, and it's got to tick all those boxes. It's a massive investment in our infrastructure, and we're using that for placemaking as well. So people feel real pride in a new bus station or a new rail station or a new transport hub. And we've got to make it easy for our passengers to get around. We're linking people to opportunities. That could be jobs, it could be healthcare, it could be training, families, social activities. We're affecting everybody's lives every day with transport. And we need to think about how we can get all those benefits across the board by having a joined up vision on master planning to start with, and bringing some of the funding streams together. We've got disparate funding streams, and actually it's quite difficult often to get those multi-benefits when we're all speaking to different funders, and we need to bring some of that together.
I think, Melanie, sort of like you really hit on something there, which is, transport in isolation gets to the same sort of issues that Naomi sort of articulated there. But actually think about the purpose, and actually purpose takes you into a sort of like a wider sort of thought process at the outset. And James, what's your view around what best in class would look at there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm not involved in the delivery in this way, but I mean, I think I'd agree with all those points. I think the only things I'd say maybe in addition was we also need to think about, as you said at the start, the adaptation. I mean, the climate change is here. What we're investing in, that's what we're trying to do in the Dare Hub, what we're investing in now is going to be shaping what we have in the 2030s, 2040s, even 2050s, when climate change is going to be very real. And we don't know the exact extent of that. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty, and we don't know how that's going to play out on a micro level, even more perhaps uncertainty, combined with other things that seem to be happening in a kind of perhaps destabilizing, kind of global context. I think the other point, as well as the growth, is always to come back to cost of living. And I think that can't be separated from the climate crisis as well, because climate shocks will often play through as inflation shocks. I mean, obviously you'll get that horrendous events with people killed and so on, but the people in higher income countries, which is not maybe the worst affected by climate change in the short term, you will often more be in kind of the shocks of energy, the shocks of price changes, and so I think it makes a really, really complicated thing about how we can manage together, because we've got the economic growth, we've got health, we've got the environment, we've got mitigation, we've got adaptation, we've got cost of living together, and I think that's the real challenge that we have now in a period of constrained money.
It is, and sort of like it gets to the heart of the trade-off point, doesn't it? Because if we even think about in the last few weeks, we saw what happened down at Dawlish with the bad weather coming down in the southwest. An awful lot of money had been invested down in Dawlish. Money has to go back in again. So what loses out in order to get there? So actually, when you're having to look at adaptation, you're also having to do not just long-term trade-offs, but actually probably in-year trade-offs when you are those, when you're an authority or you are, the infrastructure provider such as Network Rail. So I think that's great. And Patricia, in your new role, what's your view?
Well, in my new role, but actually I'm going to draw on previous work in my academic role. So I spend a lot of my time looking at new interventions and trying to conceptualize the impact that they have. And we do that looking at the environmental, economic, and social impacts of things. I think often we don't think about these things broadly enough, and we need to look, very holistically at all of these. The models that we develop in academia, I've got something like 106 different indicators in my favorite model, and I can plot lovely graphs that show how when you try to focus on one thing too much, you actually make other things worse. And the unintended consequences, I think, are really important. I think there's also a thing about what you can and can't quantify. And many of the social impacts are harder to quantify. And so it's all very well to set targets along the things we can quantify, and that might be CO2 emissions. If by doing that, you lose some of that wider socioeconomic benefit that is more difficult to quantify and more difficult to attribute, then we're in a problem space. And the final thing I'll say on that is that I think one of the challenges is that when we try to put this stuff through to sort of regulatory or incentive-based frameworks, we tend to focus on lowest common denominator. We tend to say, you mustn't do this, you mustn't exceed this. Sorry, I've done so well that I've massively improved all of this. Doesn't matter because you infringed that. And, I think we need to start counting the positives as well as setting the thresholds.
I think that's such a powerful thing to think about, because I think as well, and Naomi was picking up on it, when you think about something like Oxcam, and that actually, sort of like the consequences of fear of doing some things might actually stop some real positives if we're not careful. But I want to pick up on the point that you just made about, sort of like, doing that step back. And I'm actually going to ask Melanie sort of pick up on that, which is, how can vision-led, spatially coherent planning anchor transport investment around people and places to deliver environmental benefits by design?
Yeah, I mean, we've got some examples locally within South Yorkshire. And if I take one in particular, so Rotherham Gateway, we are developing a business case to develop a new mainline rail station at Rotherham. The city centre railway station is not on the main line. So we are one of the largest settlements to not be on the main line. And it is limiting our economic growth, but also social connectivity. So we have got a site where we want to allocate housing and employment. We're going to build thousands of houses there, and we're going to build areas where we're creating jobs as well. We've got master planning for the whole area, and the transport investment is one element of that scheme that is going to link the mainline train and the rail activity, but it's also going to provide a tram train stop as well. So at the moment we run one of the only tram trains in England, the only in England. So we want to extend that network. Just as a backstory to that from a transport point of view, Sheffield Midland Station is at capacity. So there are no slots for further expansion of any services. So by developing Rotherham Mainline, you've got an opportunity to still have your connectivity while we're waiting for some investment at Sheffield Midland. So you start to see all these things come together. There's going to be a strong place-based activity in the Rotherham Gateway area, and there's different funds of, different investment funding, so transport, housing, economic growth. And we're just bringing all that together. So we're still in the visioning stage. We've just got an approval on an OBC. We're working on an FBC for the station. Green Book comes into play, though, because it's really difficult. The BCR is low, surprise, surprise. The housing is allocated in the local plan, and we've got really steep targets, but we haven't got planning permission on site. So, the BCR doesn't count a lot of those things that are planned and that are all going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's quite difficult, but we've got lots of agencies working together with a shared vision, and hopefully we will see that come off.
And as you sort of say, sort of like that's with a vision of what you want to see Rotherham be able to achieve, that community to be able to flourish. And I'm going to ask Patricia and James with their very unique insight, just to actually sort of like help us think through about how should we be measuring and evidencing the benefits to strengthen cases such as the one there for Rotherham, but also other cases where we're looking to invest in decarbonised, climate resilient, nature positive transport systems as well. And I don't know, Patricia, would you like to start with that?
I'll try. And I say that because it's actually incredibly difficult. We're comparing apples and pears all the time, and we're looking at trade-offs, and it's about qualitative judgment around what people think is actually important. There are metrics for practically all of these things. I sat in the last session where we had metrics delivered on jobs and GVA. We can look at metrics on biodiversity and biodiversity net gain. But the socioeconomic impacts are, I think, the hardest to evidence and the hardest to quantify sometimes. The range of uncertainty associated with these is huge. In the last session, the person who was presenting did something that I confess I've done myself before, where we followed the Green Book methodology, and we looked at, the direct jobs and the indirect jobs and the induced and the economic benefits across the region. If that doesn't connect with people, and people don't identify with the fact that this thing has actually really created those jobs locally, and I think the local element is key here. I think that sometimes we can quantify things in a way that maybe nationally, internationally, and I could bore you with many of examples of where this has happened. It's the right thing because the CO2 emissions are coming down, the jobs are being created, etc. But if the people near where the intervention is happening don't experience that, then you can't continue. You can't get the next one through.
And I think that, sort of like, the role of democracy in all of this should never be understated because, when we think about the vision-led that you just spoke about there, Melanie, and the examples that you gave as well, Naomi, you've got to think about, the fact that somebody has to make a decision about this, and then these are not programs that are normally deliverable within a single political cycle. The great, modern cephalogical kind of example of that would actually be the last presidential election in the US, where, it didn't matter if the Democrats said, here are all the indicators that tell you that think we're doing a good thing. Your point, James, if it didn't feel it in the pocket and the cost of living felt bad, then people will make different choices. And then you start to see a stop-start in that. But James, what would you sort of like want to pick up around that measuring and evidencing of these benefits that, as Patricia says, they're so much more difficult to grasp on that Green Book appraisal?
I mean, I think we need methods and models that can capture the population variability in how these things are experienced, or how these things at least are distributed. We need to understand. It's very easy to kind of have a aggregate general consumer or something like, or even just a few groups. But of course, you also potentially in transport and placemaking, you're talking about a changing population. The population changes, who can afford to live there, who gets the benefits, who that accrues to, renters, versus owners, as well as then I think the additional points about the communication. And even if it's good, is it convincing? Are people understanding what's happening? I mean, I would just perhaps on the vision-based thing. I mean, this is something we tried to do earlier with the propensity to cycle tool, where we tried to come up with a kind of different scenarios of what cycling could be, going way beyond what we immediately had for the evidence of interventions, and then saying, well, okay, what would that mean in terms of the health benefits, the carbon benefits, but also saying something about the spatial distribution. So you could then think, well, let's plan around what a Go Dutch or Go Dutch e-bike, city or rural area in England or Wales might look like, but. I mean, obviously as an academic, I'm all very in favour of, kind of robust evaluations, natural experiment studies, the kind of things that can be done. But of course, it's challenging to align these with the timelines of, what government and what local authorities are doing. And to provide evidence that is quick enough and is convincing enough. I myself do a lot of stuff on the models, and I think it is getting increasingly possible to bring in a wider range of these social economic benefits with the modelling. I mean, we're doing a small project for Active Travel England on including morbidity as well as mortality within the tag appraisal. And I think beyond that, I think wider range of stuff around well-being and so on is possible. We have evidence on that. We have evidence on the effect of, it's not as good as it could be, but on greening, we have, more evidence on noise. I think it's possible to start including these in a way also accounting for how they perhaps affect different population groups differently. That it's not just here's a damage cost function of an air pollution, which is, quite abstract from, people's health and so on. Let's think about who's exposed, what they're exposed to, what their kind of baseline susceptibility is, and then what that might mean in terms of their own both health and, well-being.
And I know that, sort of like this is an area that lots of people are looking at. I know, for instance, that, the University of Liverpool has done quite a lot of work with the Combined Authority, looking at the indicators to help start to frame a different view of these wider benefits within their investment appraisal. But it's that capturing and then isolating. And I know, Naomi, you and I have spoken about this before around the sort of challenges that you've seen around this.
Yeah, and I was just listening with, real interest in the kind of descriptions you were making about how you capture those benefits and those wider opportunities. And the truth is the system is exhausting. Like, trying to crack this is exhausting because of the number of people that are the decision makers. Now, devolution has a huge role to play in addressing some of that. But if you look at a geography like mine where devolution is slightly further away, but also even then we're still going to have different layers of different numbers of combined authorities across the region. We have 4 potential new town locations, 3 within the region and 1 on the boundary in North London, on the boundary of Hertfordshire. And then on top of that, we also have housing sites, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 urban extensions in places like Swindon, all over our region. And in every single one of those, you could design better. You could design better health into it. You could design better solutions for school-based transport. You could think about home-to-school transport, total transport, how those things could address the transport system, how bus franchising might solve some of those issues. But ultimately, because there are so many layers of decision makers, and actually the market designs settlements, really, how the housing's laid out within a particular settlement is led by developers, although you obviously through the planning process capture different requirements, it becomes actually too hard to do. So I think we have small pockets of case studies in the country of where this has been done well, but democracy is where you can celebrate those and drive it through. So I think there's a bit about how do we take the evidence, how do we make it feel real for political leaders, both local authorities, combined authorities, and government ministers, so that they can then confidently use that to make decisions that are bolder than perhaps the appraisal process allows them to do on its own.
It's such an interesting idea, isn't it? Because, I think, that connection of, people to lived experience, which, James, Patricia, both of you have picked up on, which is this whole idea of, you can go through whatever lovely Green Book appraisal you want, but did you tangibly feel that you could get to the opportunity, and do you feel optimistic? And opportunity and optimism are such powerful, emotions, but actually, how do you actually, use all of that to kind of bridge the gap between the analytical and the emotional for people? I think it's a really interesting idea, Naomi. And the barrier that you spoke about there, Melanie, are there other barriers that you can see to making these kind of multi-benefit investment choices?
Yeah, it's interesting about the political barriers and the decision making. So you're implying that it's easier in a mayoral combined authority. It does bring a lot of the decision making into the same place, but there are so many other barriers. The funding is siloed. And from April, we're going to have an integrated settlement. But funding will be ring-fenced within that integrated settlement, and there's certain amounts of money that DFT have put in and MHCLG, and they'll all be expecting their outputs to be delivered. So we'll still be navigating through that landscape, and it still will be quite difficult. So we have to have the right tools to be able to do this, and I think one of the few tools that we have is probably social value on our bigger contracts. So I do think that we've got the opportunity. I mean, it tends to be particularly on capital infrastructure schemes where you would ask for a commitment to social value. And I've seen some really good schemes delivered that that I'm familiar with. So in Sheffield, we've got a Greater Green scheme where cycle routes have been put in and there's wild planting. And it looks really attractive along a corridor. And I've seen schemes like that in Leeds, similarly. I've seen an enterprise zone in Bradford where we managed to, when I worked previously in West Yorkshire, we managed to secure the social value where the contractor worked with a local school, gave all the school kids some wildflower seeds, they planted the area, and it looked beautiful. And the kids really felt that, young people, felt that they were really involved in the scheme, and it was really positive, and the community came together. So I've seen schemes done really well. We are out to tender at the moment for our new bus fleet for bus franchising. We are having a new fleet for Tranche 1, Day 1, which is September 27, for the first time on on a scheme that's not capital infrastructure. We are asking for 10% social value in terms of the way that we score those bids. So that is a new way of approaching things for us, but we really want to see the economic, the social, the environmental benefits, and we're tying that in through a sort of social value procurement route.
And James, Patricia, is there anything about that social value route in these sorts of investment decisions that you think that there's more that we could be thinking about now?
I mean, perhaps if I just said something on the previous point more, but I think it comes back. I think it comes back also to the question around the vision, because you can get buy-in around a vision. You can't really get community social buy-in around a BCR. It's not. No, yeah.
I might quote you on that.
I mean, I've spent a lot of time last year in Singapore. Now, obviously, Singapore now has many advantages. Not saying we should try and can it, but you do see a consistency of government. But you do see the capacity to get things done. You also do see they make a real effort to get buy-in. They really work at that to get the community buy-in at different levels, including the professionals, but including the communities as well. And you see the work that they put into that, and I think that's really important. I mean, I do think coming back to what Naomi said, we do have a problem at the moment in the UK in terms of governance, in terms of the state struggles to get things done, but this has been a problem for some time. I think we can talk about neoliberalism or whatever, but I mean, we're getting into a period when on the right and the left, we're seeing a lot more state intervention. And I think with kind of the climate crisis, we're going to need more of that. Now, that's not saying replacing the market, but maybe in some areas it is. And even down to what the developers are doing, where is the space for that? And can we develop the capacity to do that, and perhaps slightly have a reshape of what the role is between the private sector and the state? How we get that state transformation, I think there's political scientists maybe needed more than me, but I do think that is one of the big questions we have at the moment.
Can I just pick up on that challenge of making the case?
Yes.
I think this is so important. I lived in this city, in Manchester, at the time that the congestion charge was put to vote. I was working in a climate change centre. We were stunned when we saw the outcome of that, because we thought we knew what was coming. We thought everyone, obviously, would support it, and it was a good thing. If you look at the socioeconomic analysis around that, the communities that stood to benefit most were the most impoverished. They were the ones where they were feeling the health impacts of this. But because it's really difficult to quantify and actually sometimes to be transparent about the long-term health impacts of some of what we're doing, there was failure to sell. There was failure to sell that vision to the people of this city in terms of what could be achieved. So I think that data is great. We absolutely need it. We're in a job as academics because of that, fabulous. But we do need to get the advocates on board who are going to make the case if in a democracy we're actually to get this over the line.
I think that's such a important point. You know, I sort of think about, you might be able to tell I've got a Manchester accent, but when the congestion charge vote failed, I remember talking to a lot of my friends about it who went, oh, well, we didn't vote for that because we'll just get all of the money and spend it on something else. And I was like, it doesn't really work like that. And so there is a thing around where people, you know, we assume that people actually understand this Byzantine system way more than they do. And, you know, getting to a story and getting to a narrative that actually people connect with. And, you know, Naomi, I'm just going to come to you with a question about that, which is, you know, when we are doing these major transport schemes, how do we actually, you know, get benefits out into surrounding areas who may think that it's not really for them or it's not going to really impact them in terms of the positivity of that infrastructure?
I mean, it's really interesting. I'd like to come back on the social value point in a minute, and I'm actually going to indulge myself in coming back to something about actually my daughter. So I live in the Oxford Cambridge Growth Corridor. My daughter probably hears about East West Rail every day, and she's quite bored about hearing about it. But she, even with me in the room talking about the economic opportunities every day, she doesn't see it's about her. She's 14 years old, and we are not, maybe she doesn't care, but we will, when East West Rail comes, be within 45 minutes of both Oxford and nearly Cambridge. They are absolutely life-changing opportunities for her, and I can't make it real for her, even though I work in it. So can you imagine people who are disengaged, don't have a boring mother that goes on about it all the time, and all the other things? It's so far away from them. We have 409,000 jobs that we need to fill in order to achieve our economic opportunity in the Oxford Cambridge Growth Corridor. And yet, the principle that we're looking at the moment is how do we make those jobs for local people so we don't have to bring them all in from around the world. And it feels like we're having two conversations. So my slight pushback actually on the private sector and the infrastructure providers, of which of course the private sector work hugely with them, is I think this is a shared responsibility. I don't think it's the public sector that can drive this, because I think in the private sector you have so many people that can inspire young people more, not just young people, everybody, to understand the impact of these schemes. So the social value opportunity is enormous if the private sector and the infrastructure providers come with us on the journey. So it's not what we can set out that we need, it's actually about helping us understand what's possible. And so in our region, we have got Luton Airport expansion, we've got obviously Universal Studios coming, we've got a major new piece of infrastructure in East West Rail, we've got potential for new towns, we've got two massive growth commissions in Oxford and Cambridge. If we put together all of the social value requirements from the infrastructure that's coming in our region, can you imagine what we could do with that would then be able to make people feel it was for them? At the moment, to access some social value that's through an infrastructure project, you have to put an application form in. It might be for your village hall to be upgraded, quite nice. It's not real. Whereas if we put it all together and the providers helped us do that, we could really do something game-changing. But I think the public sector will fail if we do it on our own, because everyone's got too many other things to do. It requires a whole sector approach.
I think that's a cracking challenge to the private sector, which I are part, but also because the most bang for your buck will come with that kind of combined effect. Because, you know, if you sort of think about, you know, sort of like what you can achieve, and in my career I worked on London 2012, and, you know, the best bit of social value that we did was by far and away opening up training opportunities for, you know, the horrendously acronymed NEETs, people who just wanted to get into education and work and training. And so, that to me is, that to me is always my gold standard of social value, was actually, that was a programme that was our one big thing that we did, and we were consistent on it with every procurement that we did. And I think that it's a really big challenge. And, I'm sort of sitting here and reflecting about the fact we do quite a lot of stuff in the education sector around STEM, ambassadors, our colleagues go out and they use their volunteering days. But we probably talk about the engineering, we probably are not saying, and this is the economic benefit of it. So there's a takeaway from me from this conversation, which is how do we also become better at being translators as the private sector when we're talking to the next generation of engineers, project managers, environmental scientists who we work with now. I'm very conscious that we will run out of time because you guys have got lots to talk to us about. And I've got one more question, but before I get to my last question, is there anybody in the audience who would like to join the conversation with our couple of hands up here? That's great.
Thank you. Philip Andrews. I'm an independent consultant. I'm ex-DFT, so I've got formal business cases, okay? Just on the practicality point, I hear your point about how you persuade both the voters and the decision makers. Because they're politicians, decision makers, and they care about voters. Let's talk about this, be frank. So, without wishing to be too soft on the old Green Book, okay, the strategic case. It used to be the last refuge of a scoundrel, right? When your BCR's rubbish, you'd write some glowing vision and persuade somebody it's fine, wouldn't you, okay? Now, it's supposed to be more than that. You also take alongside, there's some of the things we're talking about, and the non-green tangibles that we just write some glossy words about, you can actually measure all the things you're talking about, health benefits. So it is a grind, but you can do it, and we need to be slicker and not invent the wheel all the time. So I would argue that that strategic case that you want at the top, I'm going to use the vision word, my apologies, okay? The opening line of that strategic case should be something you could be walk into your town hall and go, this means this for you, you, and you, but it's also the sell to a politician that goes, the BCR is a bit tricky and there's some assumptions here about the social value, but that's fine because we can generally show you that you and your punters will see real change, and that might just allow a decision maker to push the envelope on the BCR with our friends in the Treasury. So I think there are opportunities in there. I think you just got to sell that really good story, and you say everybody's got to be behind the vision at the same time and signed up to it, even if they don't like all the detail.
That's fantastic observation. And actually, I was just going to ask Melanie, the fantastic example you gave us about Rotherham and that. How has that engagement with the community starting to tell the story about that vision? How's that going? What's the experience been?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's early days. Rotherham Council are leading on the sort of wider regeneration placemaking, and they've got a number of sort of community engagement activities that have gone on, and they've consulted with people on the vision. It's as you start through each phase, really, there's more to consult on and more to engage on. So when we get into the full business case, there's an opportunity again to get people involved. But it's interesting. I mean, I've recommended to politicians a number of times a very poor BCR with a very strong strategic case. But you can only do that so many times. And more or less every active travel, walking, wheeling, cycling scheme, you have BCRs less than one. And the first few times you do it, well, it's got a strong case. But the more you do it, the more difficult that becomes. And it is this issue about, land values in the north and not being able to get the BCRs higher. The Green Book review is saying the right thing in that strategic case is important, but yeah, we recognise that, and we've recognised it for a while. So are we saying that BCRs are much less important? And it's how you bring that together. So it's quite difficult, but I've recommended that a number of times as an officer, and that's been accepted by politicians.
And Naomi?
I mean, just reflecting on the, I agree, excellent point, Philip. I think actually Whitehall and Westminster is increasingly recognising that places understand their places better, and that makes that kind of single vision much more important because you've got to make it compelling. I still think, and I know we've got to crack it, we can't just accept it. When you talk to the Treasury, they go, what's the BCR? And that's not right, and I think we can crack it, but again, as a sector, we have to do it together. I completely agree. And actually, local authorities, culturally, find the elevator pitch quite difficult, like the single elevator pitch. What's the point? Well, you need to do it in one sentence. And I've tried, even in the last week, I was working with an authority, and we had a ministerial meeting, and I was like, right, one sentence. And it was about half a page. And that was me as well. I mean, I kept adding things. So it's really hard, but we've got to crack that one sentence. I completely agree with you.
James, you wanted to...
I mean, I think on the walking and cycling, you should be able to get good BCRs. I mean, if you've got the health, I mean, we're doing some stuff, as I say. I think there is but the health benefits. I think the question is, what is counting against it? I mean, how are your models representing, what models are you using? Are they representing behavior change? What else is driving it? Do you have models that are methods that are suitable for looking at those kinds of problems? And I'm always happy to, chat that through. And I think, going to maybe the question on, making the case that we do need those models that differentiate. Agent-based models are highly segmented because we've got to tell stories about different population groups. This is how these kind of people are going to be affected. And I think back to the congestion charge. If it hit people, it's going to hit them in the pocket now. But the health benefits are always going to feel more abstract. Unless, health benefits generally feel abstract unless you're ill, you've just been given a diagnosis, or you're pregnant. I mean, most of the rest of the time, people are not so concerned about the health things, which also people can often feel quite, they're determined by wider forces beyond this. So I think that comes back to making, an economic case for different population groups, along with other things that they perhaps feel more than their health, which could be the well-being, the traffic on their street, perhaps, in the short term.
Thanks, James. And I think we had one more question.
Go on.
Is it work? It's working. So another Philip Thiessen, also before Department for Transport, now Connected Places Catapult. I kind of would like to also defend the Green Book a little bit. The problem is the Green Book has always stated that it's a strategic case first. You don't go anywhere near a BCR unless you have a good strategic case. Second thing is, you do not compare a BCR in the Northwest against one in London, because they're solving different problems. You cannot use BCRs, yet they're only BCRs, you compare them when they solve the same problem. I totally agree, come spending review, Treasury says, what's a BCR? Oh, strategic case, come on, doesn't matter. So they completely defy their own guidance, and that's a huge problem. I think there's a second problem. We don't seem to have that sort of leadership that is required for the strategic case. That is then the narrative that brings people along with you and shows you conviction. But then we have 2-year budgets. How do you have leadership in long term? So just as I'm an optimist, I'm picking up, NISTA now has a 10-year investment pipeline published. I hope that they've got some sort of certainty that the funding will come along, because what's the point? But so maybe we are finally overcoming this strange thing of 2 to 3 year maximum. And then siloed, of course, absolutely. Like, why are we even talking about co-benefits? Why is health the co-benefits of cycling? It's the core thing. And wider economic, if that is the strategic case, then the wider economic benefits are the benefits of the scheme. And then a final bit of hope, place-based business case. Finally, they've accepted that sometimes you need more than just the transport bit. You need health, you need enterprise zone, you need skills, you need housing. And finally, I mean, I was there in department trying to make it work, that a transport scheme had not just transport benefit, but land use and land use uplift and stuff. It was a hell trying to make that work across housing and DFT, but we managed. But anyway, so yeah, it's just a hopeful note that maybe we can finally move away from short-term funding, all centrally located, and a siloed approach. So I don't know whether you have got any views on place-based. I think some of the pilots are supposed to go in now, somewhere around your areas, I think.
Do you want a final
Do you want
reflection?
a final, and then, because we're going to wrap up, so it's a beautiful segue, because what I was going to just say is I was going to ask the panel, just as we finish up, it actually picks up on your point there, which is, you know, what are the practical things that we could be thinking about to embed these benefits, I think you said co-benefits there, the benefits across everything from resilience to well-being to nature. And just a thought to wrap up from the panel, just off you go, Naomi.
So I've got two. One of them is it would be amazing to work with the private sector and the infrastructure provider on making the most of kind of those wider the funds, social benefit funds. That's a sort of action. The other one is in terms of making place-based decisions. Coming back to that question, actually, it's really useful to invite the decision makers from Whitehall to come and visit your scheme. So few people do it, and actually, when they come, they realise the unique conditions that that particular scheme is trying to operate within. Don't be afraid. They're really brilliant when we invite teams out, and I really recommend doing it because it's great to spend time with them, show them that you've got sort of weird single roads in the middle of what is potentially going to be, you know, a new city or whatever. It's quite helpful to kind of make that come to life for decision makers.
Yeah, I think that's really significant. I would agree with that. I mean, we've just taken Supertram back into public control. It's over 30 years old and a significant lack of investment over that time period. We have had DfT colleagues out to see us a number of times, and we have got a significant amount of funding for the renewal of that network. And there's nothing better than seeing it in situ to understand what the issues are locally and how significant it is. And it's an absolute lifeline for people that are living in low car ownership areas. We want to give people choice in public transport, but actually some people don't have a choice. And we need to make sure that the public transport that we're investing in is sustainable. I mean, it's electric trams. We're looking at electric buses when we start franchising. So it's important that we think about the sustainability of our fleet and how we're getting people from A to B.
To be quick, I mean, continuing maybe the thing on tag and appraisal, update tag. I think there's a lot of things that need to be replaced and could be replaced by better values. Adding more things in, particularly around well-being and inequalities. And I think, as Philip's saying, some of it is going in the right direction. Some of it's always been there. And I think maybe there does need to be a bit of a push sometimes to get that people don't treat it a bit like a kind of lowest common denominator. What we were allowed to do, and we managed to do with the Pence Cycle tool, was we did much more differentiated, local authority specific mortality rates. Now, that wasn't in there, but we just did it, basically. And no one's ever said we shouldn't do it, to try and I think some of the stuff now, it's got in about agent-based modelling. It's got the potential for people to say, well, here's some guidance, but you can use this, but you can do ideally more if you've got more data and more capacity to do something that is going to include a wider range of benefits, that's going to include more segmentation, etc.
Fantastic, James.
And last thoughts from me. Places are different. I lived up in rural Northumberland for a long time. The transport system needs there are massively different to where I am now, going in and out of Birmingham every day. But I think that what we need to get smarter about is where we have the same tools developed and where we transfer insights one from the other. I was down the other week in Devon at one of the new roads which has been put in there, and looking at the carbon calculator and sustainability stuff and the legal frameworks that have been developed around that. Those are transferable. You can use those in other locations, looking at other benefits. So first thing is that we need to be seeing the bits that are translatable and making those accessible. But final point I want to make is on time horizons. I totally agree with what was said about the 2-year thing, and we all look too short because the sort of radical change that we're looking at, particularly around, some of the resilience that's going to be needed in future, has to be on much, much longer time horizons. So we have to be looking at this appraisal in a much longer time horizon than I think we conventionally do. That's difficult to do because the data becomes more uncertain the further out you go in the projection, but I think it's really essential.
Well, I hope that, you'll join me in thanking our fantastic panel. I mean, when we think about this as a topic, it's a topic where we can just learn from each other, and actually these conversations and making those connections and thinking about what isn't applicable between the North East and London, but also around that fact of, you know, when we think about nature, environment, well-being, resilience, there's actually a groundswell of people, you know, James, Patricia, Melanie, Naomi, but actually across this whole conference, across all of our organisations, who want to be able to actually not just quantify the benefit, but point at those benefits being delivered, because that's the bit that makes the real difference. So if you'll join me in saying thank you to the panel.